Okay, so I would like to have a discussion, a review, a renewed, a reinvigorated discussion about trauma to help get the treatment vibe going for folks who have just joined group. Also, as a gentle reminder and a reinforcement of what trauma is and how it ends up impacting the average human being's life. The average human being who experiences traumatic events is greatly impacted by those traumatic events. Very few people who experience significant trauma, either as an isolated event or as a serial set of events, come away from it unscathed. In fact, the only type of person that would be traumatized and would come away from it kind of unchanged or unscathed would be someone who has a significant amount of natural genetic resilience and distress tolerance and a temperament that is really laid back, and also has really favorable conditions in their life of lots of support, probably a bunch of financial resources to help, promote exercise, sleep, and nutrition, is really fundamentally good at self-care. And if it's a kid that's traumatized, they are immediately supported and made to feel safe. The average human being, I think, that is traumatized does not have those conditions. And it really ends up being a recipe for disaster. So let's just start the conversation. Feel free to use your voice. What is trauma? What is the Oxford English Dictionary definition of trauma? It's pretty simple. It is a distressing or disturbing event. Distressing or disturbing event or series of events. So what does distressing mean and what does disturbing mean? If you're disturbed or you disturb something, what does that mean?
You're bothering it.
Yeah, you've interrupted it, you've bothered it, you've stirred it up, you've changed the dynamic, and that causes a feeling of distress. Take the DI away from distress, and what do you have? Stress. So you're stressed out. What is stress? See, we're digging down and we're starting to really define. If you want to know what trauma is, you got to understand what the concepts are and the definitions. So what is the definition of stress? Let's start with physics.
The noun stress means pressure or tension exerted on a material object.
Yes, the Oxford English Dictionary uses a Brit accent. I love it. So in physics, it is force put upon an object. It's force put upon an object. So when I stress this pen, I'm doing what? Bending it. What's going to happen if I stress it too much?
Right.
Putting pressure and it'll snap.
What happens to a human being physically, emotionally, or psychically when you think about the show on Lifetime or Oprah Channel or whatever? Snapped. You push a human being too far, they will snap. We know this. How do we know this? Anecdotal evidence. You just got to observe human beings and you'll see them snap. However, the literature is replete with evidence. In fact, a certain famous psychiatrist and psychologist at Harvard in the 1950s did deliberate experiments on community members, Harvard students, to see how far he could push them psychologically before they broke down. The Marine Corps does it every single day in boot camp. That's right. So, stress is, in terms of psychology and behavioral health, stress is events, stimuli, things coming at you from your environment that you immediately start to interpret. The human brain is designed to watch the environment, everybody, including infants. The only exception, I think, would be in utero, which is probably like heaven for some babies. Some babies. Just read an article on trauma in the womb. When mothers are traumatized, what happens to the in utero fetus?
It traumatizes
They
the
are
baby.
traumatized. So the human mind is designed to be watchful of their environment and to evaluate, interpret, define, and categorize events, stimuli coming at the individual. And the interpretation is literally, is this safe or is it not? And when something in your environment is interpreted by your brain as being unsafe, it kicks in a involuntary neurological, cognitive, emotional, and behavioral response. If something is tolerable and safe, you tend to discard it. Or you in the back of your mind you say, okay, that's safe, I'm going to come back to that later. But every human being is first and foremost vigilant of danger in their environment. Everybody, whether it be mandated by God through creation or through evolution, if you believe in that, it is mandated. So stress is when something comes at you that your mind is interpreting as being dangerous, unsafe. And if you are too stressed, too much stressed, if you have too much stress in your life, what happens?
Don't break.
Potentially. It impacts the way that you think, feel, and behave. It impacts the way your brain operates. And if you are stressed too much, too often, and you don't have the skills to manage it, you will change.
Oh, well.
And your behavior will be the thing that's the most obvious. And if you've ever been locked up, you get locked up based on behaviors, supposedly, right? There you go. Most people who are locked up for a long time have an absolute history of traumatic stress response. So, not everybody, but most people. So trauma is a distressful event or set of events that you've experienced. And trauma stress response, or PTSD, or when people say trauma, it means the results of trauma. You know, when I got trauma, it's not really about the event. It's about what happens later. So we spend a lot of time in this program discussing that, not the details. I mean, if you feel comfortable talking about the details of what happened to you as a kid or as an adult, feel free to share it as long as it's safe and it doesn't, trigger a whole lot of other people. We do have to be careful. But what we end up doing is we end up understanding what trauma is. We accept that we have had trauma, if you have. We learn about how it affects us. We accept that that is just true, that the science is not debatable. We accept that the way we think, feel, and behave has been ingrained in us, programmed into us. You reconcile your prison history, your violence history, your abuse history, your behavioral history. You reconcile your anxiety and depression. We learn about how mental health is affected by trauma. And once you've learned all of that and accepted it, that reveals what to do about it, which is develop a set of skills to cope with stress. Why is that? Because when you've been traumatized, you are set up to respond and really react predictably every time you are stressed again. And it gets to the point after a number of years, if you're still alive, that the wind's just got to blow, or someone looks at you funny and all of a sudden you are responding predictably. The predictable responses to stress for a trauma survivor are fight, flight, freeze, or fawn.
More fun.
So if you are the average trauma survivor that has seen some shit and experienced some shit and been to some dangerous places and survived it, it's not about, whew, man, I survived that. Thank God, I'm going to seize the day and I'm going to go forth and prosper and live like every day is my last one and I'm going to No, it's about, man, how I survived that, and now I gotta watch out for danger every minute of my life, because in order to stay alive, you gotta be on point. Raise your hand if when you're in a room, you look around the room, you watch your back, and you know where the exit is. Raise your hand if you have a loud noise in your environment, you jump up and you're on point. Raise your hand if, I mean, the list goes on and on. If you don't understand why that is, you are likely to believe the labels of antisocial or psychotic or just a bad apple. We're here to discard all of that, and we're here to get to what's real, which is if you're in my group and you just know that you have had traumatic experiences, or if it's questionable, then you learn that you have, and then you learn about what that means and then what to do about it, you're in a position to change a lot of things. And since we are judged by our behaviors, I think the behaviors are like one of the things to address. You will also learn categorically that for the average individual in my group, much of the reason, if not most of the reason, you all use drugs and alcohol is as a response to stress. Once you've been traumatized and you've survived it, you are set up to, when stressed, react very predictably, either with violence. I used to work in a city school where the little boys, 5th and 6th graders, they would punch you in the face before, in their minds, you punched them, because they've been abused their whole lives and they just assumed everyone was out to get them. True story. But of course, the administration, the principal and the school resource officer, that clumsy cop that would walk around, and then all the teachers would just assume that's just a bad ass, it's a violent person. But in their mind, they're going to fight, they're going to hit you before you hit them. Pure trauma response. Anger management, antisocial stuff, pure trauma response. Fight. Flight means when I'm stressed, I'm out of here. I might not even say goodbye. Peace. If I ever disappear from your lives, either aliens abducted me or I have been traumatized to the point where I got to take off. And that looks probably like, some disaster in my family. Boom. Now, of course, you would leave anyway, but what I'm saying is that for trauma survivors, stress can lead to peace out, I'm gone. Flight, I'm out of here. Freeze means I'm shut down. And then fawn is an interesting one. They've added that somewhat recently. It's where you, and it's usually with domestic violence, it's like you fawn, you embrace the abuser or the neglector, you embrace the stress because people pleasing, seeking approval. The only way I know how to deal with this is by, if I leave the house, he's going to come find me and kill me, or she's going to come find me and kill me. So I may as well just stay here, and I'm going to be, to keep them happy, I'm going to, so that's fawn. This is manifest. This is how it works. Here's a really important thing to understand when it comes to trauma. Every human being is designed to respond with fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Every human being, except for maybe an infant, although infants with their crying all the time, it's trauma response. I'm hungry. I'm scared. Every human being. Everyone. So for example, the average functioning individual, if they saw a tiger walking towards them, they'd probably run away. Or in Jurassic Park, since T-Rexes couldn't see movement, they would freeze. I have a cat named Maggie, a calico cat, very spirited. She would be bullied by Herbert, the big cat, the big male cat, and she would display every trauma response, aside from fawn. She never fawned over Herbert. But she would either fight if she was cornered, she would run away if she had an avenue of escape, and sometimes she would freeze. Because if you're an observer of human psychology, you can actually learn a lot about human psychology by watching animals, because we're close to animals. So I would watch Herbert sitting in the corner and not really paying much attention, and Maggie would walk across the room, and then Herbert would look over and she'd freeze. Mm-hmm. In fact, her calico coloration had to do with camouflage. So she would fight, and when Maggie fights, you ever heard a cat fight? It'll make the hair on the back of your neck, and she's spirited. And she would always get away. And she would run if she could, and she would freeze if she had to. She would never fawn. So all animals, all human beings respond to imminent danger, realistic danger, in such a manner. Have you ever been hiking in the woods and you hear something rustle in the bush and you immediately get on point? 999 times, unless you live in Australia or like parts of Africa where everything's dangerous apparently, but 999 times out of 1,000, that rattling is going to be an insect or the wind. But the one time out of 1,000, it's a pit viper, a rattlesnake. Being on point to either fight or flee is going to save your life. We are engineered to be on point and to be vigilant for danger. Trauma survival makes it so that we are always on point no matter what, 24/7. That's why when you see someone snapping at Kroger for no apparent reason, it's because the stress in their life is adding up, so that it's the straw. When someone bumps into them in the line and then doesn't say excuse me or doesn't say anything, that's when they snap, because it's the straw that broke the camel's back. And then some people are so traumatic stress response reactive that it doesn't take much at all to trigger fight, flight, freeze, sometimes fawn. An insensitive, casually observing society doesn't understand that. So when you behave inappropriately in society, you are judged accordingly, and you end up in trouble with consequences. Sometimes you can explain that, or you can get a letter from a therapist to help explain to whomever it is that is judging you to take it easy because this is a trauma response. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. It is our job as human beings in recovery to understand how we respond to stress, learn the skills to do something different so we can be safe and accountable in society. That is called trauma-informed self-care. So, that is an overview of trauma for folks who are new or for folks who haven't heard in a while. Why is this program? Why should any program? Why should your program of self-care be trauma-informed? Because it's a reality, and it needs to be. If we know that you have survived trauma, disturbing, distressing events, then we need to understand that, we need to be knowledgeable of it, and we need to develop skills that are appropriate. So what is trauma? Abuse and neglect. Being abused, physically, emotionally, sexually, psychologically, or neglect. Not given enough food, not given enough shelter, not given enough clothing, being exposed to violence, having violence perpetrated on you, or witnessing violence. Natural weather disasters like earthquakes, tornadoes, hurricanes. The hurricane in Thailand 15 years ago, unbelievably traumatic. People had their entire families washed away in front of them. Tsunami turned, it wasn't a hurricane. Tsunami turned into correct. Bullying is traumatic. And then, of course, being in dangerous situations like war zones or juvie or prison, etc., etc. So that's trauma in a nutshell. We will revisit it. It's very important that we understand it, and it gives us a roadmap to wellness. If you haven't been traumatized, if you're not a trauma survivor, cool. If you have any questions, we can help determine that. One of the ways we determine that is by viewing certain tools like the Adverse Childhood Experience Survey, the ACE, the so-called ACE quiz. And the reason that's important is that the brain develops, and all kids have undeveloped brains. And when kids are traumatized, it is even more impactful than when an adult is traumatized. Many adults who are traumatized were also traumatized as children. So when a child's brain is disturbed with trauma, the development goes off course, and unless they get special treatment, which most kids don't, it will continue to develop off course. Off course. Development is somewhat of a linear progression, and trauma skews that progression into a tangent, if you will. So understanding, if you know that you had a rough childhood, abuse, neglect, violence, poverty, not enough to eat, if you know that, it's good that we know that because we know what we're up against. The good news, the really good news, that's all kind of bad news, right? Not really, it's just news. The good news, and this is good, I'll put that label on it. The good news is that what we know about the brain, what we've learned in the last 20 or 30 years, the brain is, it's called neuroplasticity. So rigidity means it breaks. If something's plastic, it means it bends and it can be stretched. The brain is plastic and malleable and it can recover. Whatever damage has been done can be healed. Trauma is an injury. In the emergency department, a trauma is a broken leg or a broken back. And that can cause emotional trauma. In my world, it's an emotional, cognitive, or soul injury that requires healing. You lovely folks, raise your hand if you're a trauma survivor and you know it. Raise your hand if you're a childhood trauma survivor and you know it. Well, folks, this is why we're here together. We are here to heal. We are here to heal, pure and simple. Self-care is healing. Healing requires self-respect, self-forgiveness, self-compassion, self-understanding, self-sympathy, self-empathy, everything good, add a self to it, because that's the way to heal. The other thing about healing, anyone ever broken a bone? It hurts. Yeah. Healing hurts. It is painful. Healing hurts. It is painful. Whether it's a broken bone, whether it's a laceration that requires sutures, whether it's a soul injury that requires compassion and love and understanding, healing hurts. Expect some pain. Do not confuse pain with suffering, even though you always have. Do not confuse healing and wellness with suffering. It is the antidote to suffering. But this stuff is painful because we're healing. And guess what, guys? That's okay, because if you're in this group, my guess is you're right where you need to be. And for the individual who's seeking inpatient, make sure where you're going is trauma informed, because otherwise it's probably not going to be as helpful as it could be. So, that is
Thanks for that info about Galax. I'll take that into consideration.
You didn't hear that. Yeah, no worries. And glad to help you in the process. So, at any rate, this is a kind of a I don't know how we're going to phrase it, a whirlwind tour of trauma. It's the when in exercise you talk about high intensity interval training. This was the high intensity interval training version of trauma. Bunch of information real quick. Don't worry, you won't be quizzed on it. We have plenty of time to dig into those concepts and figure out what they really mean. It's very important, though, that if you bring those experiences to the table and you're trying to make meaningful change and you're attempting to learn the skills to cope with stress and avoid using drugs and alcohol and get your family back and recover your health, you have to understand the role of trauma stress response in all of those activities. As we mentioned last hour, we're here to do something different. And we have to understand the barriers, the challenges to actually changing. It's not enough to just say, hey, I need to change. It's not enough. Start. You got to understand how your mind works. And thank goodness we know how the mind works.